for you all is how many of you would believe me if I told you that Snickers bars and Milky Ways are not in fact competitors? Most people, if I went out and posed that to, they'd say, of course they are, they're candy bars. You find them in the same part of the aisle. They might even quote me the percent of market share that each one had. They both are purchased by the same average demographic, it turns out. And yet, when you view it through the jobs to be done of why someone hires a Snickers bar or a Milky Way, they actually don't compete with each other at all. Jobs to be done, as many of you know, is perhaps the second most popular theory attributed to my late mentor, Clay Christensen. And Clay was often fond of saying that disruptive innovation was one of the most misattributed, misquoted theories around there. I'm looking at Bill Solomon as I say that. But it turns out the jobs to be done often is as well. Because we often think that we can sit in a boardroom and hypothesize about why people would buy or consume a certain product or service. And the reality is that we actually almost always miss the social and emotional components of why people make the decisions that they do. Far more important, frankly, and ironically with the panel I'm about to moderate after this, more important than asking people what they like or don't like about something is to watch what they do, to see the movie of actually how they make a choice, the struggling moment in their lives, the progress that they're seeking to make, and the actual decision and trade-offs that they make when they do it. When you see that through the prism of jobs to be done, you realize that a Snickers bar is hired as a meal replacement. You're on the run, you're on the grab and go, you don't have time for a meal, and you're not you when you're hungry. Grab a Snickers because it really satisfies. It turns out before the jobs to be done research was done, M&M Mars actually didn't realize that. And you look at the advertisement before and it's literally all over the place. And once they realized that people were grabbing it to fill that hunger, it totally changed the way they advertised it. They realized that its competitors weren't Milky Ways and other things that they manufactured, but things like Cliff Bars, Red Bull, things that you grab and go to get an energy boost to make sure you can make it through when you haven't had a meal. And they changed the product design itself as well. Ever notice when you bite into a Snickers how it feels? It's crunchy, it's thick, right? The nougat actually rolls up into a ball so you feel like you're getting a real full meal. And the chemistry of it, this is going to gross you out before lunch, it sinks to the bottom of your stomach and literally soaks up the acid from your stomach so it makes sure that you aren't hungry right away. A Milky Way is a very different experience. We hire it often as a consolation. You've had a rough day and you relax with a Milky Way. It competes with ice cream. And if you bite a Milky Way, it's soft and smooth. The chocolate melts in your mouth. It sloshes around. It gives you this luxurious experience. So what does this all have to do with higher education is an interesting question. But as part of the book, we created over 200 mini documentaries of students actually making the choices to go to the schools that they do. And we diagnosed what are the jobs to be done that they're hiring colleges to do. And what we found has at least three major implications that bear on the perception of higher education, in which we'll talk about in the next panel. The first one, well, first section, let me give you a very high-level summary of the book. It's going to be super high level. If you want to get the real summary, you're going to have to buy it. But we found 5 different jobs to be done. The first one is students who are saying, I want to go to college to help me get into my best school. It's all about the act of getting into the best as they define the best. Very little what they'll do there. They want the classic college experience with the dorms and fancy quads, the opportunity to reinvent themselves with new people, sort of what we've sold as the classic college dream. It's the logical next step in their lives, but they have very little sense of what they'll do when they're there. Many of them will say that they're pre-med, and 3/4 of those, it turns out, once they hit organic chemistry, will be out of the pre-med track. The second job we found is sort of the flip side of that. It's what we call help me do what's expected of me. For many students who were in the help me get into my best school, when they don't get into their dream school, they fall into this one because they feel like they have to go because someone else expects them to go. Someone else says, this is what you need to do to satisfy my expectations, in essence. And they see no other choices. They see no other options out there, so they opt for higher education. And by the way, they say, this can't be a bad thing. It'll provide a safety net for me. I know it's something that I should do and I ought to do. But it turns out that their apathy is extraordinarily high when they go to college in these circumstances. And when times get tough, they often drop out or transfer, 74% of our sample. The third job we found is what we call students that are saying, help me get away. These are students who are running from something, but not necessarily towards something. And school is something socially acceptable that they can say that they're going to. The fourth is what we call help me step it up. So these are students who basically say, what I'm doing right now, it's not who I am at the moment. And there's people depending on me, and I've got to do better for myself and them, and it's now or never. Time is running out on me. It's time I stepped it up and got the practical skills or certifications that I need to make progress. The last job we found is what we call help me extend myself. And I think of this as the lifelong learning job, where these were students who were deeply yearning to learn more, be more, challenge themselves. But if it didn't work out, they were totally happy or content to go back to doing what they were doing. It was all about making time and budget so that they could pursue something that they've always wanted to, but the risk was relatively low. And if you're a college thinking about that, or any higher ed institution, and you're serving students that are coming to you with a multiplicity of those reasons, which you undoubtedly are in many of these cases, a few things happen. One, in the effort to be all things to all people, you create a lot of complexity in serving all these different jobs which have radically different outcomes and expectations and desires. And as a result of that, that drives administrative overhead cost up and up and up, which leads to cost increases, which leads to dissatisfaction when you start to look at the high price tag for a lot of these institutions. The second thing it does is it creates one-size-fits-none institutions. So institutions that not only are complex, but they're also trying to serve all these different things, and by their nature, therefore, are suboptimal for almost any one of these, which creates dissatisfaction in the actual choosing experience and the actual consuming experience itself. And then the third thing I'll just push on in this audience is that you'll notice that I didn't say that students were going explicitly to get a job in any of those jobs to be done. There's a lot of reasons for that, but part of it is that a job is sort of assumed in all five that I mentioned. It's sort of like I assume it's there, and if it's not, I don't know what to make of it. But the other piece of this is that the percentage of 18-year-olds in the United States today that actually are in the labor force, that have had a real job, is the lowest in our nation's history. They have no sense of what a job is or what their opportunities are even out there. They're looking to gain this education to start to get those insights. And I think a lot of the dialogue right now, it's parent-driven, but not necessarily student-driven in some cases. I'll just leave you with one story from the research, and then we'll dive into this panel, just to sort of shape up, I think, how difficult some of these trade-offs are for colleges and universities right now, and the importance of being really clear about the purpose and your mission as an institution. One of the students we talked to, Naomi, was a student who grew up in the middle of the country, an abusive stepfather, two younger kids that her mom made her take care of that were 13 and 14 years younger than her. She was an all right student in high school, and she wasn't sure if she would go to college or not. Neither of her parents had. But when a coworker of hers at Taco Bell told her about a college that he went to 3 hours away, it sounded like an amazing opportunity to, frankly, get away. She wanted to get out of earshot of her stepfather in particular. And as she looked online at the school, it looked picturesque. It looked like a wonderful experience. So she applied. She got in. It was the only school she applied to. And when she asked her mom, hey, do you want to come with me and visit this campus? Her mom said, no. You go on yourself. And in her words, when she stepped on campus for the first time, her language was, it felt so liberating. And you can imagine why. The challenge is this. She was all about running away from something, not necessarily towards something. And when she got there, she didn't know how to consume the experience. She partied hard. She changed majors 3 times. And she landed on the academic probation after the first semester, persisted through the second semester, and then stepped back and said, this is going nowhere fast, and I've got $40,000 in student private loans now. And she dropped out. You imagine that student who's running from something, not necessarily towards something, and a 4-year experience is simply not going to be the right fit because they've got to figure out what that purpose and passion is for that next step in their lives. It's not just about running from, but what are they going to run to? You can multiply this across the different jobs and manifestations even within them, and you see the enormous complexity facing higher education, and I think driving a lot of the discontent that we will now talk about. So I'll invite to the stage Andy Rosen, Deirdre Latour, and Stephanie Marken for the conversation about the perceptions of higher education. Thank you so much.
Who's around here?
Start with that. Where are you gonna be? I'll stand up, I think, so I can see all. All right, super appreciate having these three experts on because they've been monitoring the pulse of global sentiment, not just US sentiment, but global sentiment toward higher education. But where I want to start the conversation is in the US first, and then we'll move out. And Stephanie, maybe I'll start with you if that's all right. What is the current state of consumer sentiment toward traditional higher education? Let's modify it, not just higher ed in general, but traditional higher education. And how has it specifically changed in the last 5 years? Like if we were here 5 years ago, what would that conversation look like?
Yeah, it'd look very different. And Rachel kind of teed us up perfectly in the last panel to discuss some of these data. So if you are catching up and didn't see the report that we released in December of 2019, Gallup recently released research from a long-standing study that we've done asking just US adults, a nationally representative sample, about their attitudes towards college and specifically any sort of education beyond high school. So we have a few different questions that we ask in that survey. And the data point that Rachel was mentioning in the last panel was about the percent of US adults that said it was very important to get additional education beyond high school. So very generically open-ended about the type of education that looks like. For most people, they do think about traditional higher education in that question, so going to a 4-year degree granting institution. And what we found there was markedly different than what we saw in 2013 when we last asked the question. So this year what we found was about half of US adults said it's very important to get additional education beyond high school. Important there is the trend line, right? Because we kept the question consistent over a 6-year time period when we last asked the question in 2013, when about 70% of US adults said the same thing. So about a 20 percentage point decline. And in Gallup world, that's particularly significant because we track trends across all industries, and it's really rare to catch such a large scale change in the trend line. I think something that Rachel was alluding to earlier, though, is we have to make sure we're using multiple data points. So I think it's important that we don't get hung up on one single poll, one single metric. We obviously are asking US consumers every day how they think about education and their experiences. So I'll leave you with a few other data points and would love to hear some reactions from the panel. One of the others that gets a lot of attention is our most recent survey in which we ask people about their confidence in higher education as an institution. And as was mentioned in the last panel, we are an anti-institution society right now. So all institutions are generally distrusted when you compare it over a long-term trend line. The poll that I'm mentioning specifically is a survey that we've conducted for 30 plus years, where we ask about a series of industries and we ask individuals the extent to which they have a lot of confidence in those industries. Now, in this most recent report about higher education, we saw that about 48% of US adults reported they had a lot of confidence in higher education. You may say, well, that's pretty positive because it was actually tracking the top quartile of all industries in which we track. We also ask about Congress, so the benefit of that is if you're in a survey about Congress, you're never going to be last. And what we found was that 48% was actually a significant decline since the last time we measured that, which was actually 57%. And again, you might say, well, that's not huge, that's 9 percentage points, but in Gallup world, that kind of trend, that kind of change is actually pretty dramatic in the total population. And then I'll leave you with one other number, which is one of my favorites, which is a survey that we asked through the Gallup Alumni Survey, where we ask individuals the extent to which they believe their degree is worth the cost, which is really what we're all talking about here today, right? Because it's cost for the individual, but it's also relative to what they're trying to get from higher education, which has been talked about a lot this morning. It's not the same path for everybody. It's not the same outcome for everybody. And what we find is just 50% strongly agreed that their degree is worth the cost. And I think that's a really important metric that we have to track over time, and the individual schools need to be measuring.
So this is why you never try to compete with Gallup, because Gallup is the best in the business of doing this. So I work at Pearson. I've been in education for years, so I know about 2% of what you all do about education. I came from GE, I was there for 14 years. So what struck me coming into Pearson was how academic we can be about academics. And I come from a consumer marketing and communications background where, I mean, the Snickers example is a perfect one where you actually listen to the people and understand what they want. And I thought I'm completely with Rachel and what she said earlier. I thought it was really interesting. So we did a different approach, which I think is complementary to what you guys did, which we did a 19 country, 12,000 learner survey that was all about emotions and all about the psychology of where people are. Not so much, do you think it's worth the cost, but how do you feel about these things? And what we found is, and this is, all morning this has been echoed, but we're in the middle of the biggest economic change since the Industrial Revolution that was said earlier, I think by Michael, and it is the talent economy. So it is the idea that you piece together your education over your life. It's lifelong learning. We surveyed age 16 to 70 in 19 countries. And what we sort of found is we're calling it DIY education, right? So it's a mix of what you get from a higher education institution. 60% of the Americans we surveyed said YouTube was going to be one of the main drivers of how they're going to learn. So that is a big component of it. There's also the idea, I mean, the 40-year career is dead. It's absolutely dead. So the way a lot of us thought about careers is dead. So because of the gig economy and how people think. And there's this idea now that came through of the slashy career, right? Which is, in a perfect example, is David Solomon, who's the CEO of Goldman Sachs. He's the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and then over the weekend in Miami, he was DJing because his second gig is DJ Saul, he's called, right? That is not unusual now. That is the norm, is that people don't want to be put into one bucket. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing around the world, but particularly heavily in the US.
I think all this discussion so far is about perceptions of higher ed, and we've heard a few times today about, people are suspicious of institutions. In a lot of forums you'll hear, the Democrats think it costs too much and the Republicans are wary about what goes on a college campus. I think we ought to be careful not to avoid maybe a reality problem, not just a perception problem. So Michael gave a talk in which he outlined some pretty important reality problems of higher ed. The data has something similar, which is, 30 years ago, or over the last 30 years, the cost of higher ed has gone up by double the rate of inflation, so it's about triple in constant dollars. You all know this fact. You also, I think, know, at least generally, that in constant dollars, the income of a graduate is about the same as it was 30 years ago. So the price for essentially the same thing has tripled. So higher ed is still a fantastic investment, right? I mean, it's, I think my colleague Brandon let me know that it's got on average a 15% return, right? If you could find an investment with a lifetime 15% return, take it, right? But what it means is that return was a lot higher 30 years ago and is going down, and so for some students, an increasing percentage of students, that return is not that good. So there are other people for whom it's fantastic, right? So what we're finding, and Brandon, who used to be at Gallup, of course, has come over to Kaplan and has brought some of his polling capabilities with him, is finding that students and families are increasingly open to alternatives to American higher ed. So I agree with Rachel when she said that it's, we're talking about higher ed and not necessarily about learning. But, Tower Records went out of business. People didn't stop listening to music. But there's no claim on education that today's higher ed institutions have. Students and people generally will continue to learn, but through what modality? And what Brandon's research is showing is, if you ask students, would you be interested in pursuing a higher education outside this country? Large numbers of families say, yeah, we'd be open to that. So a lot of you may have seen what he published in Forbes just a couple weeks ago, which is when Americans are asked, which would you prefer, an internship with Google or a degree from Harvard, 60% of them said they prefer an internship at Google. I mean, that is stunning that any company an internship could compete with, much less outperform, a degree from Harvard. So I think what we're seeing is families and students are open to alternatives. I'm not sure the killer app has appeared yet, but the opening is there.
I think this is an important point about what people's aspirations are. So use the Google internship as an example. When people describe why they enroll in higher education, they report job-related reasons. That's just the reality. So if that's your reality, then what you're expecting to experience while enrolled looks very different than somebody who enrolled maybe 20 years ago and had a different outcome in mind. And so when we talk to higher education consumers, they report things like not necessarily seeing their aspirations reflected in the higher education story nationally. So many of those people that we talked to for which they said, no, I don't think it's as important, said, I don't really see myself, meaning what I look like and my goals, reflected in higher education today and what it offers. And that's a problem because many institutions are offering great partnerships with workforces like Google and employers like Google where they can get that internship, but that story is maybe not articulated in a way that we're not connecting back to why people are enrolling in the first place. We heard that a little bit in the first panel, like getting closer to people's aspirations for enrolling from the start. I don't think it's any coincidence that WGU is one of the fastest growing universities in the country, and they actually make that connection very explicitly for students when enrolling and before enrollment. So I don't think that that is happenstance. I think that's a very intentional outcome of that approach.
Yeah, you know, if you're ever bored and you have nothing to do and you want to entertain yourself, go on Chronicle of Higher Education comments page, find one of the articles about the importance of a liberal arts education, and just post. You realize the number one reason students go to college is for a job, and then cite one of, 1,200 Gallup surveys to that effect. You'll get reamed by people who think that that is an attack on liberal arts, that getting a job and getting a degree in a liberal arts field is somehow contrary to one another. And you know, one of the issues that we have in our higher ed system, one of the things that causes these perception issues is people feel like they have to be on one side of the equation or the other. This is job training. You know, we're a lot more than job training, or you know, we're trying to create greater minds. And it is a real problem. I was on a panel like this a couple years ago with a dean of arts and sciences from a top 10 university who expressly said, employability is not our responsibility. And I thought, boy, I hope all your students are signing releases when they enroll in your school to learn that, because of course it's part of your responsibility. It's not your only responsibility, but it is the number one reason why people go to college.
So let me jump in. For those of you who haven't seen me moderate a panel before, I prefer to disappear, and so this will be my last question. But then we're going to go out to you for questions. So just start to gear up in about 4 or 5 minutes. But I'm curious. So where does this all lead, and what does traditional higher ed have to start doing? Right. So there's a lot of data on the discontent. Are we actually starting to see people act in accordance with the discontent?
The institutions, yeah. I mean, I'm not even sure why we're having this conversation.
Same.
I mean, really, is this the conversation we're having? This is 2 years ago, guys. This is 2 years ago, okay? Rachel is today. Northeastern is today. ASU is today, okay? Western Governors is today. We know what we need to do. We know what we need to do. We just launched an app, which is a first app for us. It's an AI app. It's Calc 1. Someone mentioned Calc 1 earlier. Calc 1 is a real barrier to STEM, because if you can't get through Calc 1, which I tell you I would not be able to. So if you can't get through Calc 1, then you can't go on to STEM degrees. So we did this AI tutor. It's the first of its kind, where you actually, in math, you have to write, because it's the way your brain works. Take a picture of it on your phone, and the algorithm actually figures out what you did, what's right, what's wrong, and then doesn't give you the answer, because that's not teaching, but teaches you sort of, and it's full of videos. So it's all this immersive content, right? People expect to see the way they get everything else. Why do I go on websites and they tell me that these shoes are for me? Because they know me. The algorithm knows that I'm gonna like these kooky shoes. Education has to be the same thing, right? That's what people are expecting. People want jobs. It doesn't mean they don't want to learn. I mean, the best comment I hear in the education space is, we have to teach people, they have to learn to learn. And I'm like, what does that mean? I mean, and parents, have you ever heard a parent say, I'm going to send my kid to school because I just want him to learn? I mean, this is, it's
For
not where the
$80,000
world
a year.
is. It's not where the world is. So I think we have all the answers.
But I think you're right, that there are plenty of institutions that are responding. And frankly, I think it's the right conversation to have with a group like this, because the job of people in this room are to help figure out solutions and help others. I mean, frankly, the reason we do polling on these issues, internally at Kaplan, is to try to come up with solutions that can help institutions respond. And you can do it. So, Purdue, I think, is the shining star here. I mean, it costs less to go to Purdue today than it did in 2012. They've frozen tuition over that period and really focused on the practical, work-ready approaches that are possible in an elite institution.
Yeah.
And what's happened? Applications have skyrocketed, enrollment is larger, revenue is better. I mean, it's like fairly obvious stuff. And any institution can do it. I see Michael Sorrell over here, the president of Paul Quinn. Paul Quinn was, I think it's okay for me to say this, Michael, was as far on the bottom of the American higher ed totem pole as you can be. And Paul has personally said, what is the purpose of higher education? What can I do with an institution like this? How can I serve the students that I'm serving? And has raised the profile of that school in a spectacular way. Any school can be successful with the proper leadership and the proper, and I would argue sometimes the proper partnerships with the right organizations.
With Kaplan, specifically.
That would be a good one.
Or Gallup.
I lied. I want to push you guys a little bit. So this is we're seeing macro trends of this, right? Are there some places where people are not feeling these dissatisfaction for higher ed and there's intensity? Because there could be a more segmented world and nuanced world, right, of how people view this. A Western Governors University degree is perfect for some people, but certainly not. I mean, from my research directly, it would be the last thing possible for someone to help me get into my best school. It would be the worst place for them to go.
I mean, it's
so I'm curious how you see that.
It's pretty universal. I mean, you have differences by country in how people feel, right, about their education system, which is very specific to their country. So we saw, for example, South Africa is an important country for Pearson. South African numbers were dismal. I mean, South Africans just feel like they are just not being educated, but largely across the board, it was very similar of, lifelong learning, reskilling, upskilling. In China, in India, massive numbers. They are way ahead of us in reskilling, skilling, and upskilling, and the people understand that that's part of how they have to live their life and run their life. So that was a big one. So I don't know what you would say, but I think the trend line is pretty much where the U.S. is just different situations and problems.
Yeah, I completely agree. So from a population perspective, we see the same attitudes exist really regardless of where you sit. There are some differences between age groups, et cetera, and of course the sharpest decline that we've captured is among youth. But I think one of the more interesting pieces of variation is what we see individual schools in terms of how their alumni rate them. So WGU was here today. We work with them to measure alumni outcomes among their population, and what you'll see are dramatic differences, for example, in how WGU graduates rate the institution on things like degrees worth the cost and what we see nationally in our benchmark. And I think you'll see tremendous variation among many of our partner institutions, all of which are releasing their data publicly. And I think that is actually where the differences exist. And it's not by chance or the type of students that necessarily enroll, it's programmatic differences, right? If you're at WGU, you have a mentor who tracks you on a regular basis and understands both the personal and the academic challenges you're facing. That is part of what they have very much focused on. You see that in their data. There are other institutions that we work with, you see the exact same story. So I think there are great stories, but they are at specific institutions, and they're generally institutions that are experimenting, to your point.
One trend I would add that came up earlier this morning, and I think is just huge, is people all over the world, the 19 countries we surveyed in, really understand that they need soft skills now more than ever. So the trend, this came up earlier today, a couple of people mentioned it, the trend of, I understand, and this is not me, none of this is my opinion, but from listening, I understand that in order to beat the machines, I have to be more human. I can only beat the machines by being more human. And that is something that people inherently understand. So the more we can help and offer. And I think Rachel's talking about companies. It's a huge thing for companies, right?
If we're talking about global, the return on investment calculation, to the extent that that's what's driving all of this, is very different. Like the denominator in most countries is not anywhere close to what the denominator is in the United States. So in Australia or Canada, for $5,000 a year, you can get a degree. And in most of the world, of course, it's a 3-year undergraduate degree. So much less expensive. So the return, doesn't have to be as great. Your earnings don't have to be great to cover that cost. And I will say that work readiness seems to be an issue, globally. I mean, every country that we operate in seems to be concerned about that from time to time. Even Singapore, which, Singapore is I'll just say a very well managed, economy.
Yeah.
So 23 industry targeted industries. They map each industry. They specifically say we need this number of people with these capabilities. They divide. There's a minister for each of the 6 clusters that those are, organized into, and they will work with every institution in that country to make sure that they're getting the kinds of people they want. Even in a place like that, they still feel like we don't get quite what we want. So I think that the work readiness is kind of a global issue.
Let's go out for questions, and let's make sure that they end with question marks. That's the only thing I would ask. We have a hand back there.
My name is Tyler Whitehouse. I'm from Gigantum, a software company. But I spent years in higher ed, teaching math at University of Minnesota and Vanderbilt. And so the one thing that hasn't been mentioned here, and I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on it, is the attitude towards higher ed is tied up with the attitude towards knowledge. And I saw a lot of anti-intellectualism in my students, mostly because of the difficulties that courses like calculus presented. It was just a barrier. So to what extent should we be teasing those two things out, or is the attitude towards knowledge irrelevant?
It's a really good question.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I've never seen a study address that directly. So I could say qualitatively that I absolutely think the two are tied together. And I think it's definitely persistent more so in specific parts of the country. I do think it's regionally different. I don't have a great data point to answer it, but I think it's a really interesting hypothesis.
Michael's going to answer it.
Go ahead. Do you have an answer?
No, were you going to?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I think people do understand that they need an education or learning, to use Rachel's term, in order to get the kinds of jobs that the future is going to create. So whether they're enthusiastic about that or not, there's an acceptance that you can't just hide in your shell. So yeah, there's an anti-intellectualism, but in terms of actually getting a job, people will do what it takes in order to be eligible for the next job.
So the Gallup poll that came out, I think, last week or 10 days ago, whatever, I thought was fascinating. It was radically different in terms of what people are saying is important to them and their view on things than I would have expected, and I think probably most people in this room would expect. Also interesting was the view on education and the problem with education, which, it seems that there's growing importance on recognizing that there's a real issue. Why do you think in the political priorities it hasn't elevated beyond what it really is? Because I think the Gallup poll last week showed people are pretty happy about a lot of things and think a lot of things are going a good way, but education people seem particularly alarmed about. So why isn't that a political issue, I guess, is my question, to put a question mark at the end of the question.
You go start. You start.
Well, I'm going to give you a personal opinion. It's not backed by Gallup research or anything else, so it probably doesn't deserve much deference. But
Never stopped anyone on this stage.
Education, first of all, our political system doesn't work very well on any topic, and anybody who's really touched education over the course of the last 10, 15 years has gotten burned, right? Whether it's Common Core or for-profit education, or it is an issue that nobody really wants to dig into certainly at the national level and even to some extent at the state level. There's a very strong current in this country that education is a local issue and everybody else should leave it alone. And so anybody who tries to nudge things in one direction or another is in trouble. And I would just say, from our country's perspective, there are many other countries in the world who think very differently about these issues, and their education systems are starting to demonstrate it. And I mean, it's a cliche, but it's true. The country that out-educates the other is going to succeed in the long run. And I think it's a real danger for us.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't have a Gallup data point to address your good question, but I just don't think education is a particularly sexy topic today in politics. I don't think anybody wants to touch it for some of the reasons that Andy mentioned, and No Child Left Behind and some of the negative connotation with K-12 policies that have been furthered in prior administrations. And I think that we're still struggling to address it both from the K-12 level and the higher education level. I don't think anybody also has one great solution to address some of what we're discussing, and I don't think there is one solution, right? I think it's multiple solutions. We talk about having like one silver bullet that's going to fix higher education. It's not that. It's not that for any industry. It should be multiple solutions in combination. I think some of the other topics are more enjoyable to talk about, honestly, and get more reaction from individuals, and that's why they get more attention from candidates.
It's not a priority for this White House. It's not a
That too.
priority. So, I mean, look at the town we're in. It comes from the, whether it's local, state-based, we get it. It's not a priority. So that's number one. I think when you're in other countries, I work 1 week a month in London. It's such a different energy and discussion around education outside the US. You all know this better than I do. It is a priority for 10 Downing. It is not a priority here. I think, and you talk about anti-intellectualism, I mean, it depends on the president's view on reading and writing and arithmetic, right? So, I really think it depends on, it's a big leadership challenge in my view, and it's just not where we're at as a country.
But, having said all that, this is all opportunity for the people in this room, right? Because we have a market-based system in which the government,
Totally agree.
for the most part, is not stepping in and saying you have to do certain things. And yet, as Stephanie described, there's a real sense in the country. The country gets it, right? They understand, as a group, the country understands what it wants. And so those institutions or organizations that are able to provide what the country wants are going to thrive. So, like, you can take all of this and say, "Oh my gosh, we're doomed," or you can say, "Boy, this really sounds like
agree
opportunity."
Totally. Yeah, you're right.
We have time for about 2 more questions. Bror.
Bror Saxberg from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Very related to this, how do we sharpen the market signals for higher education success back to families and students so that our market actually does evolve towards these things that are highly valuable for everyone's future, as opposed to kind of being stuck? It's not going to be policy stuff. So how do we sharpen those market signals?
That's a good point. I mean, one thing I've seen a lot of research firms do, of which Gallup is one in the last 10 years, is talk about lifetime earnings, right? We talk a lot about earnings. There are probably 1 million studies about this. Brookings Institute estimates that 60 to 75% that a bachelor's degree earner will earn over a lifetime over somebody without one. So I think everybody's very clear on that. I don't think that resonates anymore as effectively with the final population we're trying to serve. So if you think about the target population and the things they're focused on, income is absolutely one of them. You can't have a successful life without it, right? It's very hard to provide for your family if you can't make ends meet. Income is important. But that's just part of what higher education can provide. It can also provide for things like well-being and quality of life outside of your earnings. Because fun fact, after $75,000 a year in household income, your well-being is no better. So most people don't realize that it's not just all about money. There are other aspects that higher education can provide. I don't know what the solution then is for individual schools in terms of how they communicate it, but I will say for most people, all they hear about is earnings potential, and that is not really reaching much of the population. I think that's part of the problem. We've been so focused on articulating the mathematical equation about how much you earn and not meeting people where they are in terms of what they're looking for.
I totally agree. It's such a great question because it is a communications challenge, right? It is. It's sort of like, like the media. The media has a perception problem, right? It's like you don't want to be in that bucket of higher ed and how people think and talk about media. And I think there's a huge communications opportunity. It's all opportunity, as you said, I think, to explain and evolve the role of organizations and what the options are, and stack in all the different ways you can do it, stackable credits, short courses, video courses, whatever it is, online learning, and how we're just trying to meet your needs and evolve with it. Because the challenge is just, you talk about the earnings over time, and it's the cost to get there. So if you're gonna have $100,000 in debt, it doesn't matter that you're gonna make some decent money, right? So, but it's such I'm not giving you a good answer, it's a perfect right question, which is the room should be rallying around how do we tell the story, I think, in a different way.
Well, and one other thing I'll mention on the tuition piece is it's very hard for a student today to figure out how much a degree is going to cost them. We are in denial about that. We're talking about the access issue earlier. So much of it would be solved if, as a student, I could go online and figure out how much a degree was actually going to cost me over not just 1 year, but really my 4 years there, if we're talking about a 4-year degree experience. Tuition discounting and easing has made it very complicated for a consumer who doesn't maybe have a lot of parental support in their life to actually access and experience the admissions process. I think that's where we're actually leaving a lot of people behind, because it's very hard to figure out what that cost even is right now.
And then we as a group, we work around the margins, right? So a decade ago, Pearson sold 20 million textbooks, and this year we'll sell 2. So 2 million.
Andy and I are going to buy each of them.
That would be really a dramatic decline. That's so funny. 2 million. Because students, and now of course it's all digital and stuff, and we have a million other businesses that are doing different things. So, but it's a really good illustration, I think, of students go, oh, I got to pay how many thousands of dollars a year to go. So this textbook is $100 or whatever. I'm not going to buy that. Right? So people are trying to figure it out around the edges, when I think we should help give them a more holistic solution, I think.
Yeah, if I could just add, Ted Mitchell in the previous panel talked about requiring the measurement of outcomes. We're asking accreditors to require institutions to measure their own outcomes. They don't have to report it, they don't have to compare it, they just have to measure it in some fashion.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty baseline standard, but it is a standard at least, which is, sometimes that's a big goal. My own view is every university ought to join some collective that is comparing outcomes. That is, again, the government shouldn't direct what that collective is, but everybody's got to compare their outcomes. And Brewer, I think there's a role for Chan Zuckerberg or the Gates Foundation to help schools think about how to measure learning, because, schools do not compete on learning. They compete on a lot of different factors, but not, generally speaking, on learning. And that is a surprising fact to most people. We all understand that here. But in part, it's because everybody is teaching something different. Like they define their outcomes in different ways. They may or may not measure those outcomes. If we required the designation of what the outcomes are you're seeking, and have some common standards about whether you've achieved them, and it's going to have to be a third party of some sort, and probably not the government. In fact, definitely not the government to do that. I think we could make some progress, because let's get universities competing on learning, not just on the sort of I hate to say climbing walls, but not on some of the other things.
Shameless plug for educationqa.org, but go ahead, Bill.
That's all right. I'm Bill Salmon. I'm a teacher, I think is the best way to think about it.
Thank you for teaching.
Thank you. I had a good gig. It's not a problem. I think the problem right now is that we have both parties with a common narrative, which is you're not doing well, and it's not your fault. And I think in that kind of dueling, we know how to fix the problem, the enemy is insurance companies, the enemy is elite institutions. I think answering these questions about things that involve commitment and investment and personal responsibility is particularly hard, because the default position is they're the ones who are causing the problem. And I don't remember a time when there was that common narrative about a search for enemies and not about solutions, but rather this quite depressing perspective. That question has to.
You're from HPS.
What was my question?
I'm hoping you have a good joke after that.
Well, you guys react? Do you have a thought about that, and then we'll conclude the panel?
I think it's a fair point. A fair observation. I would just say that universities feel picked on in this whole process. I actually am very optimistic about the future of universities. Not necessarily universities as a whole, but individual universities that rise to the challenge. And when I said that there's opportunity, it's not just opportunities to compete with universities. I actually think that competing with universities in this country is really hard. These are the strongest brands in our country. They're the strongest brands in the world. So they have our universities have a big advantage over everybody else in meeting these goals. The biggest opportunities to me is to help them succeed. And there's a lot there. They're worthy of help, because if we can just nudge our universities to be a little more aligned with what our society needs, they've driven the country's wealth and success to this point, and I think they will over the next century.
The irony is the greatest antidote to that division is education, right? Like the more you understand and learn about other people, the less you demonize them and other groups and I think you're absolutely right. Like I said earlier, I named a bunch of universities that are leading the way here. So I think we are maybe getting towards what you're looking for. I don't know, being optimistic.
Yeah, we paint higher education with a really big brush, but there are amazing schools, many of which we've discussed today, that are doing things differently and really innovatively. I mean, I am one of the people who strongly agrees my degree was worth the cost. I would re-enroll in a heartbeat. I mean, I think many of us are here today are in higher education because we had that type of experience. I mean, the challenge is that's not reaching enough people.
Well, maybe I'll conclude it with saying you all did well, and it's all your fault. So thank you. Please join me in thanking them.